and I'm gladly going to introduce the ULAS Archaeological Services, the University of Leicester Archaeological Services. And they are here. They are first going to present us a video, but I'm going to pass the microphone now because I'm getting nervous.
Hello and welcome, everybody. We're going to do things a little bit differently this year. So we're going to start with a little video of our some of our discoveries, so you can see the sort of things that we've been doing over the year. And then we've got two talks. The first is by Alice Forward, who's our post-excavation manager, who's going to be looking at the East Midlands research agendas. And ULAS has been quite instrumental in developing these, and she's going to look at how we've used those to pursue our archaeological interests and how we integrate them with our projects. And then Matthew is going to give us an update on the cathedral. So without further ado, shall we run the video? Hopefully it works. to it. Thank you very much. I don't have any epic music to accompany me, so I feel a bit underwhelmed now, but never mind. So I'm going to introduce to you today the East Midlands Historic Environment Research Framework, which is a really important resource to anyone working across the East Midlands. Every site that we excavate on or work on, we work within that framework, and we use that to help frame and try and understand, prepare for what we might expect. And then we revise what we anticipate, or what we revise that once we've come off site to then actually deal with the material that we found in reality. And so I want to talk today about the Iron Age element of it, because that has been recently updated. And to put two of our Iron Age sites that we've excavated this year into context within that. So I've got 4 sites on here because initially I was going to be talking about 4. But anyway, so I've got 4 sites up here. And so over the past 12 months, ULAS has excavated and is actually currently on site still at Sileby. Sites that have encountered Iron Age settlement and activity. The work that we have done has uncovered significant finds assemblages that are still in the post-excavation process. So we're just coming to the end of assessment for the Broadnook site. We are about to go into analysis for Corby Glen, and Grantham is about to go into assessment. So they're all at different phases of their process. So as just said, 2 of the sites are now at a point where we have framed the post-excavation analysis phase. And I'm going to talk about these sites from a slightly different perspective today. And rather than necessarily final results side, I want to discuss the sites from a post-excavation perspective and looking how we can get the best from each of these sites, and how this is then framed within the Historic Environment Research Framework. So just as a little bit of background, because it's quite important to know where this has come from, really. So back in 1998, the framework was devised as a series of county overviews, which was sort of coordinated by ULAS. There's Pete Liddell in the room, who was part of it, Jeremy Taylor, Nick Cooper was part of it. So this was something that really came out of Leicester. Then there were 2 updates in 2006. So this is the 2006 version, and then further again in 2012. And then it took its first, I call it baby steps, to digital baby steps in the form of a wiki. And this is now available, and I've put the website up at the top so anyone can go and have a little look at it. And it's a really important resource. It gives you an understanding by period of what's important and significant across the whole of the region. It gives you some of the most up-to-date information that you'll need by period 2. And then it provides a framework and an outline as to how we can start to develop and think about things differently and progress all of that information to better understand each particular period in time. Then also later, earlier this year, the later Bronze Age and Iron Age resource was updated by Stephen Willis. This is a really massive piece of work, and again, I do urge people to go and look at it because it's an incredibly useful point of reference. And he goes through this period, looking at different themes within it, different elements and different aspects of evidence, of archaeological evidence throughout this period in time, changes over time, and how we should maybe be thinking about things. So how does the framework help to support the work we have been doing on the sites that we've been on? So for example, the Lincolnshire site at Corby Glen, we don't
often work actually in Lincolnshire. We mostly work in Leicestershire. And so the framework has provided an important point of reference to think about those sites more widely within their local context. And but ULAS, as I've just said, has mostly works in Leicestershire, and we have actually contributed significantly as a organisation in understanding and recognising Iron Age archaeology in the county. And that's where Broadnock comes into, which is the second site I'll talk about in a bit. So to demonstrate how we're using the framework to approach post-excavation in particular, I'm going to just pick out a couple of priorities for analysis and use those examples and relate them to the sites that we have been working on. For those who are not Iron Age specialists or are not familiar with the area of the subject area, over the last 30 years, our knowledge of Iron Age archaeology has grown significantly. We really didn't know a huge amount, really, before the introduction of PPG 16. And this is particularly apparent in Northamptonshire and Leicestershire, whereas for Lincolnshire, it's actually, because of there being a lack of development, especially in South Lincolnshire, little is known in that area. So the work that we have been doing at Corby Glen is actually really important and adds to what is currently limited evidence available for this area. So I've decided to look at two themes, really, and these are strategies taken directly from the research framework. So the first one is Strategy 4B, refining first millennium BC ceramic chronologies. You can all read that. And then they have two key objectives as to how we can do that. So I'm going to focus on that one. And then the second is on environmental research objectives. And those are quite detailed, but again, it's worth going to those and looking at them and looking at how work that's being done can be integrated into our overall understanding within these themes. So for chronology, with the increase in knowledge, we know what the key identifiers for Iron Age material culture are. And for the middle to late Iron Age, this is the ubiquitous scored ware. If you get that, you kind of know where you are in time, or certainly more broadly, middle to late Iron Age, which is too much of our project managers' frustration or project officers' frustration. Please give me a tighter date. It's middle to late, and you just can't get it closer for a lot of the time. So there are problems in the refinement of dating with Iron Age pottery, as the fabric, so the material it's made of, the key identifying element for many of the sherds we find, can be the same for pottery from the Neolithic through to the Iron Age. And when we encounter scored ware, we know we are happily in this later period, but not always sure where. For the two sites discussed that I'm going to discuss further, there are clear phases of occupation and activity, with ditches being cleaned, recut, moved, and in the case of our site at Broadnock, we've got changing boundaries in the forms of pit alignments to continuous ditches. And the pottery is on one hand helpful, but equally it is challenging to determine nuances in the material, which then should really help provide support for phases through time. We just can't always do that straight away. And I was chatting to John Thomas about it, and he did want to press that actually we have had some development within our understanding of this. So the sites that he excavated and led at Beaumont Lees and Humberston, they were able to show a bit more progression with the pottery. So that you can sort of look at the changes in the way people are decorating pottery. And so there's a distinct middle Iron Age through to later Iron Age, where in the later Iron Age, there's a more regular scored ware pattern. And I've got illustrated examples from a site at Glenfield, which is another big Iron Age site that we've excavated, where they were able to sort of identify so, again, at this site, also look at changes in time and be more specific about that. And they identified early Iron Age pots, which I think might be that number 9 at the top, those fingerprint impressions on the shoulders. So scored ware is important, but actually for us, it doesn't always give us the detail that we really need. So I'm going to talk about our sites, and we can look at some nice finds now. So Corby Glen, this is the site in South Lincolnshire, and we have, as you can see at the top, we have an enclosed settlement. Enclosed also means normally later, so that always gives us a nicer idea and understanding. We have roundhouses, and the pottery from this site was Middle to Late Iron Age with probable later material because of the forms that were coming up. But there are hints of earlier things. We've got a weaving comb, which is broadly dated as early to mid Iron Age. We have also some earlier quern as well. I think that's my next slide. There you go. We have an earlier saddle quern as well, which again there are these hints that there's earlier activity. And but then we have this later group of material, which from the previous slide, there is some Roman activity on the site. So we do know that the site goes through into the later period, and we have this list of things that we found all together in a pit. The problem with this site, and when we're thinking about going back to the research framework, thinking about chronology, thinking about radiocarbon dating in particular, we just have, there's pretty much an absence of charred plant remains and animal, but well, charred plant remains certainly from the Iron Age features. There are some here and there, but not enough to be able to happily date things. So for this site, we've come up with the idea that there was a scattering of horse bones in the top enclosure and that looked quite distinct. And so we're going to actually, because there's a commonality there, date some of those horse remains. And then within one of the pits, there was a big dump of animal bone, and you're much happier to see 14 at that point in time. So hopefully start to unpick some sort of chronology there. But for a site like this, which is really, really typical and common for the East Midlands, the absence of charred plant remains means that it's very difficult to start to put into place some sort of good structure to refine your dating. But we're giving it a go. I'm going to move so in comparison, the Broadnook site at Rothley is pretty stonking. So you've got lovely pit alignments, which are normally sort of later Bronze Age, early Iron Age. You can see them down here. James, you can tell me if I'm wrong. So, and then we've got Neolithic pits. So sorry, we go earlier on. So we do have some Neolithic pits on site, and you can see this a really, really busy landscape. And James is doing the assessment at the moment, and there's a complex sequence of stratigraphy going on here. We've also got saddle querns, which are an early thing, which could come in the Bronze Age. So again, don't know. There are these hints, but the pottery doesn't give us anything definite, and that's really difficult. And this is quite a good example. So what we've also found from Broadnook is a fragment of cauldron, Iron Age cauldron, which is pretty unusual, although we got, can't remember how many from Glenfield, but a stack of them. So they're not unusual for us, but we've got this cauldron fragment, which is 2nd to 3rd century BC in terms of dating. So that puts us earlier on. We have this really lovely saddle quern here too. And actually, I'll show you. Saddle quern comes from a bottom fill here. The cauldron comes from here. There's this big recut and cleaning episode here. So they are part of some sort of earlier activity going on this site. So actually we can use additional material culture to start to unpick and untangle earlier elements of the site. The other thing that has been absolutely amazing for Broadnook has been our charred plant assemblages. They're brilliant, unusually so. And this has meant that we can actually start to put together a really good strategy to better understand the phasing and the chronology for this particular site. And so we're going to look at points in the stratigraphy where there's good charred plant remains, where there's pottery available too, and start to build some sort of tighter chronology for the site. So that's chronology, but it's sort of very much integrated also into our understanding of environment and landscape. And I've got pitfalls and potentials here. So this is a quote from the Humberston volume, the John Thomas's volume, but this is Angela Monckton, who was the archaeobotanist here for years. And as it says, most Iron Age sites in Leicestershire have only a sparse amount of charred plant remains below 5 items per litre of soil. And this is the charred plant remain table for Corby Glen. And as you can see, I think 6 is one from there. That's not going to be good enough. Plant seeds can wiggle through the soil, lots of worm action. It's not going to actually give you a nice understanding of date for a site. And so you can't use that really to determine or build a chronology for a site. It's not good enough. But actually, for the Broadnook Rothley site, we have really, really good material. So I'm just going to, so Rachel, our archaeobotanist, I'm not going to take any credit for this. She's written some notes for me so I can kind of give you the wider understanding of what we have. So 171 bulk samples from Neolithic to Late Bronze Age, and 102 of them had charred plant remains, 60%. That's a lot. That's a lot for Iron Age sites in Leicestershire. Bearing in mind, we've also got earlier features going on here as well. So the Neolithic samples were dominated by hazelnut shell fragments. So we've got some hazelnut shell there. I think, were they sort of down here, James? One north. So and that's kind of Neolithic like, isn't it? You get weird pits, scatters here and there. That's kind of sometimes all you get, really. 2 samples which had provisionally been dated the Iron Age based on their association with nearby features, as well as a small amount of pottery, were actually also abundant in hazelnut shell. So we will be looking at that for C14. We'll be testing that, trying to understand, is the pottery intrusive, or actually have we got one of those small assemblages that we've by default called Iron Age because everything else is Iron Age, but actually fabric wise it might fit. But the hazelnut shell, because the cachets are good enough, it's a primary dump of material, then that should give us a good sense of the backfill of that. So the Iron Age samples were generally small scatters of domestic waste. They're a mix of grains, chaff and seeds, but we had 4 of the samples had more than 5 items per litre. And the most abundant sample was from a post hole, this weird post hole in enclosure 1, tons of barley grain deposited and little else. And so Rachel at analysis is going to sort this more. She's going to look at the weed seeds as well. She's going to look at, there were no signs of germination and the grains were mixed preservation. So she thinks that this is spillage. And there was another one where it's dominant in chaff, weak gloom bases, a mix of emmer and spelt. Emmer and spelt together might mean it's slightly earlier. So again, we have a chronological question there. Do we have actually transitional, what we say, so late Bronze Age into Middle Iron Age, or early Iron Age, sorry, or early Iron Age into Middle Iron Age? And can we see changes in crops over time? And that radiocarbon dating will really help with that. And also, James, you really sampled the site big time, didn't you? So that's where it's really important. And the other thing about Broadnook is we had waterlogging, and waterlogging is really rare and unusual on Leicestershire sites. Wendy Smith, the archaeobotanist who's looked at this for us, has said she can only find a couple of comparable sites in the whole of the county. So this is really significant and important. And I've put some of the results up here to show you what we've been getting out of them. So we've 331 pottery sherds, that lovely mid to late Iron Age date, but actually from this one, I have a feeling that some of these were diagnostically potentially later. But our pollen results and the waterlogged plant remains, and this is only through assessment, so we've got more phases to come, have given us a really nice idea of starting to get an idea of the landscape surrounding this area. In the Iron Age, certainly, we'll be able to radiocarbon date this to get something more specific, but we have grassland. But that does quite fit with the way we're understanding how people are exploiting the landscape in the Iron Age, certainly the later Iron Age at this particular time. So there's buttercups and dandelions, grasses, we've got pine and oak, there's shrub, nettles. And so we've got this really good multi-proxy approach, which again will help feed back into those research questions. So I think I've been quite quick, but I sort of want to round up. It's really important, or the research framework is really, really significant to us and the way we work, because the sites that we are working on and the results that we are getting are founded on key research ideas. And this idea of developing and doing new things and making sure that the work that we do has a greater contribution to our understanding of the archaeology in the East Midlands. And then my thanks.
I felt it needed something festive. Right, yes. So I was here this time last year talking about Leicester Cathedral, and I'm here again because inevitably with all of the excavations, the good things turn up after you've told everybody about the site. So this, this is an update for a couple of features that we found earlier this year, which have proved to be quite intriguing, or will do. Again, we are very much at the beginning of the post-excavation process. We've only just started the assessment on this project, so there is going to be lots more to come over the next few years. But again, here are the last sort of highlights from the dig itself. A lot has happened at the cathedral in the past year. It has reopened again after 22 months of closure. So you can go back inside it again, but they are still constructing the new Heritage Learning Centre, which is where the focus of the excavations actually was. We ended up the excavations with 1,237 burials from an area smaller than this room. We had a total depth of archaeology of 5.5 metres for the deepest feature. We have had a pilot radiocarbon dating programme take place, and we now know that our burial ground spans 850 years of continual burial from the late 10th century through to the mid-19th century. This was the slide I used last year to show where we were on site at the time. So this was pretty much this week last year. We were still excavating the burial ground at that point. We were getting underneath it in a few areas. So sort of this corner over here, slightly darker, less burials going on. We were starting to identify what looked like a series of large medieval quarry pits underneath the burial ground that had largely destroyed all the Roman archaeology. We were getting hints up in this corner, for instance, of Roman yard surfaces that weren't looking too exciting, and we weren't expecting any great Roman discoveries because of later truncation. This was it at the end of the project in February, when we finished the main phase of excavation. Ignore the mini digger there, we pretty much did all hand dig all of that. And what then had transpired then in those sort of final 2 months of the excavation post-Christmas was some of those medieval pits proved to be a lot more interesting than we had anticipated. So this was the sort of plan before Christmas of what we were thinking. So those orange areas of the Roman archaeology surviving wasn't looking too great. The green areas were all of these large areas of early medieval pits underneath the burial soil. But then the pit on the top left-hand side says burial pit there because it had early burials sinking down into it, some of these late 10th century burials sinking down into it. But as soon as we'd cleared that burial layer, which was just settling into the earlier fills, we started uncovering fragments of Roman masonry at the bottom of the pit. So now we've suddenly got a Roman building that we weren't expecting on site. Substantial but small structure. That red dashed area represents the floor space for the room. It measures about 4 by 4 meters square. It is stone constructed. It has a nice concrete floor, and it is sunken floored as well in relation to the external ground level. So it's semi-subterranean structure. So the floor level where the photo scales are, the external ground level in relation to that is where the two archaeologists are sitting top right. So they're about the external ground level. So it's about my shoulder height below the external contemporary surfaces. It has an entrance where the archaeologist in orange is coming in from its southwest corner. And again, that entrance seems to be a semi-subterranean passageway as well. It had a nice stone flagged floor, the passageway coming into it, and it seems to be the passageway was external with the sides, the soil held back by timber shuttering. There's a line of stake holes around the edge of the flagstones, and it is coming from the west and then turning 90 degrees to enter into the room itself. Substantial concrete floor on a nice big granite base. Hints that the walls were painted. There was one tiny little area of red paint still surviving on the base of the wall, suggesting it has a red painted dado level. And most of the other mortar plaster coming out of it, and it wasn't a lot, and it was all very crushed, was white painted with a few coloured stripes on it. So I think it's probably a red dado with a white panels with borders, coloured borders around them. There was also, in the biggest chunk of wall surviving, a hint of a possible niche in the wall as well, although I will admit that could just be where a stone has come out. Jury's out, but it's a bit regular for it, and it has precedent as well. And in places on the wall, it looks like the painted plaster has been deliberately smashed off, but that could just be purely part of the demolition process to get at the stone behind it. So it's this tiny little structure in the corner of the site. We still was a lot of medieval pitting. It still has largely destroyed a lot of the Roman area. It is a small building, seems to be either freestanding as a single room small structure, or it's going off to the west, but it's definitely not going off to the north, the east, or the south. And it's surrounded by yard surfaces, effectively. So the rest of the space does seem to be external and has been external through the entire Roman period, it seems. We've got some early Roman pits that I suspect are going to be late 1st, early 2nd century at the bottom of the sequence. And then it's all just repetitive layers of gravel surfaces, sort of interleaved with soil layers and made ground for higher surfaces. So what is it? It's a curious structure, but it's not the only one like this we actually have in Leicester. So this was an excavation on High Cross Street near to All Saints Church back in 2017. And again, we had slightly larger, but a single room freestanding building with a sunken floor. This one measures about 5.5 by 4.5 meters. No obvious indications for what it might be. It was a lot more destroyed and disturbed than the cathedral example, but this one had an apse on one side. It also shares some other traits with our structure at the cathedral, in that it seems to be, it's this one here in the middle, it seems to be in the centre of the insula, surrounded by townhouses and other domestic sites, and it seems to have an alleyway projecting off the main street towards it as well. And perhaps the most comparable example is only 100 metres from the cathedral at the old Shakespeare's Head pub. This was excavated in the 1960s. It's not actually been published, but here we have an intact Roman cellar, walls still surviving up to sort of 8 feet or so above the floor level. It has an entranceway from one corner. It has niches in the walls. It has evidence of windows in 2 sides as well. It's got a niche in each of the 4 windows. It doesn't have a floor surviving in this instance, but those walls were painted as well, and there was surviving painted plaster in places on those walls. Now, none of these structures have given us in in their structure themselves a clue for what their purposes were. The fact that they've got painted walls, though, would perhaps, or at least 2 of the 3 have got painted walls, would suggest they might have a social aspect to their use more than just simple storage spaces at any rate. And the analogy I've sort of been using of late is, if this is a wine cellar, they're having wine tasting parties in it as well. It's that social use of a space. Doesn't mean it's not for storage, but it could have other purposes as well. But at the cathedral, we might be starting to get a hint at what these structures are, because out of the primary demolition layer, we've had a fragment of Leicester's first Roman stone altar, a base of a stone altar. Now, we also know the demolition for, and this, I think it will be later than this, but we know the demolition for our cellar at the cathedral can't be any earlier than 273 AD from a coin off at the base of the demolition. I think there's a few other coins that are going to be 4th century. So I think we will end up with a demolition date in the 4th century, probably a construction date in the 2nd century, although that one's going to be really hard to pin down because of the later demolition to it. But it's definitely a Roman demolition rather than a post-Roman demolition. This isn't medieval quarrying of Roman stonework to destroy this building. This is an act of demolition in the Roman period. So here's the altar base. Sadly, it has broken off, and I'm pretty sure it's an old break. It had been clipped by one of the piles for the cellar, but I'm pretty sure that the majority of it was a break of antiquity. Unfortunately, it's broken exactly below where any inscription would have been on it. So it's going to be sadly an unknown altar base. But if it is an altar, and it is coming out of, and it seems to be coming out of the primary demolition layer for this building, so as there's no other obvious place for this material to be coming from, it might be from the building itself. It raises the question, are these sunken floored buildings that we're getting in Leicester, these ones that with all of these sort of comparable traits, are they little shrines? They all seem to be in domestic contexts, but all little freestanding structures tucked behind the building frontages. Which sort of rather neatly leads us into this story that the cathedral has. It's there across their website, their new website. It says Leicester Cathedral. It's a 900-year-old cathedral built on a site of a Roman temple. And I've been trying to get rid of that line out of the cathedral literature for years at this point. But it all comes back to when the cathedral rebuilt its tower in the 1860s. In 1861 then, the workmen digging the footings for the new tower stumbled across what were described at the time as Roman walls. And they were reported in the transactions to the Leicester Archaeological and Historical Society. And this is the plan that accompanies them. And it's the red ones that were identified as Roman walls. And the antiquary at the time goes, this undoubtedly proves there is a temple beneath the cathedral. Now, that seems to be coming from late 18th century discovery during grave digging of large quantities of animal bones beneath the cathedral tower. And the antiquary then, John Throsbury, links the discovery of animal bones beneath the cathedral tower with the discovery of large quantities of animal bones next to the jury wall at Holy Bones, which had previously been interpreted as a Roman temple. And because of that, he goes, well, it must be a temple under the cathedral as well. And that story has stuck ever since. Of course, we actually only have a 1-paragraph description in the transactions of what these discoveries are. It's not a huge amount of information. The only wall of these 4 walls that is convincingly Roman is the top one that had 2 column bases on it. The rest of them could actually be medieval for all we know, because we've certainly in the recent works we've been doing here, we've found earlier phases of medieval walls beneath the cathedral. Now, we know the cathedral has been extensively rebuilt in the late 19th century, but it also has gone through a potentially 900 to 1,000-year-old evolution. We now know we've got a burial ground going back to the late 10th century. So even the earliest phases of the fabric, the medieval fabric surviving in the cathedral, are 13th century. And so we could easily have an earlier medieval church underneath it that is of a smaller scale. So we do have to bear in mind that these walls may not be Roman, although I'm happy that the one with the columns on it is. When we look at the site then, in the context of the Roman city, we are again, like the other sites, right in the middle of the insula. And we've got this little tucked away cellar tucked back behind the frontages. And again, some of these gravel surfaces are hinting that we might have an alleyway coming close to it off the street, may do. And then these other Roman fragments of building that came up from the tower, these are these ones in the middle and over the cathedral. And the cathedral has rather elaborately interpreted this as a Roman temple that underneath it, but we have to bear in mind it could quite easily be facing the other way. In fact, I'm pretty sure it is a portico or a colonnade, but I think it's probably for a building to the north of it rather than a building to the south of it, with at least, I feel this one here at least is probably a medieval wall. I'm not sure about the other ones. So I'm trying to desperately avoid the word temple in anything I say, but it does look like we might have discovered a new class of building, Roman building in Leicester, with this 3 sets of cellared buildings that might perhaps be shrines. The final discovery of the project inevitably comes up when you've gone off site and the one feature you think that's definitely, you can know it's gone beneath the natural level, it's not going to have anything in it, we don't need to worry about it, we hand the site back over to the contractors, they start work, and then of course something significant turns up and you sort of see the contractors starting to wince a lot. It is this feature on the top edge of the excavation. At this point, this is right at the end, we are 5.5 meters down this feature. And what we had written off as a large medieval quarry pit, which had a load of backfilled natural red clay in the bottom of it, turned out to be a clay capping for a mass burial, a medieval mass burial. So the bottom of this feature was 5.5 meters below modern ground level. It is still about 4 meters below contemporary medieval ground level, from what we can tell. It is a deep, square, vertical sided shaft that has been dug on one edge of the burial ground. The first layer had 45 skeletons jumbled in it in a complete mess, completely overlapping limbs with bodies wrapped around other bodies. From what we can tell at the minute, it seems to be a mixed population in there as well. There is adults and children at the very least. We dug one layer. There was a nice dark soil layer underneath. Is that the end? No. Then the second layer came up, another 44 skeletons out of the second layer. Now getting rather tricky to dig. And then a final layer with 34 skeletons in. Dumped as a mass, each layer has a mass of buried bodies in it, 123 skeletons altogether. So good contender here for this being a plague pit, for instance. Absolutely looks like something, certainly a mass casualty event. On site during the excavation, the pottery coming out of it was making us think perhaps it was going to be 14th century. It is right on the edge of the burial ground, right on the eastern edge of the burial ground, and each layer is tipping from the same direction, from the southeast corner of the pit to the northwest corner of the pit. And it feels like it is probably a cart being brought along the passageway, St. Martin's East, along the edge of the burial ground and tipping bodies into the pit. After one load has gone in, soil has been placed in to cap it, and then another load has been brought, and then another load, and the final load was sealed beneath the red clay that had been dug out of the pit in the first place. So we do actually have a contemporary or near a contemporary account of the plague in Leicester. Henry Knighton, the chronicler from Leicester Abbey, tells us that it spread through the land from Southampton and Bristol, and thence cruel death spread everywhere with the passage of the sun. There died in Leicester 400 in the parish of Holy Cross, that's an old name for St. Martin's, and so on in every parish in great numbers. So here is evidence from a near contemporary of the plague that Leicester was really badly hit by it. And some suggestions have been 55% of Leicester's population died in 1349. However, we have radiocarbon dated it, and I ignore everything I've said because it has come back 98% likely 1030 to 1160, 68% likely 1048 to 1152. So this is a currently undocumented mass casualty event in Leicester from the latter half of the 11th century or the early 12th century. Now, obviously, that's going to become a major focus of our investigation going forward, is what is this mass burial pit and possibly what is the cause of death of the individuals in it. There are various things that it could be. From one thing we sort of feel reasonable that we can rule out at the minute, because there wasn't any obvious evidence during the excavation, was violence, but that hasn't had the osteological analysis. But It is not an isolated event. It's actually the second mass burial pit we've had from this burial ground. The other one is slightly later than this one, but it is also now the third cemetery in Leicester that has produced mass burial pits. So St Peter's underneath the John Lewis store, St Clement's down near All Saints down on the river, both have also previously uncovered mass burial pits. And they are all of a broadly contemporary period as well. They're all sort of late 11th or early 12th century. Now, we can't tell, at least at the minute, we can't tell if they're contemporary events. I doubt we'll ever be able to tell that they are contemporary events, but they are certainly happening around about the same time. And Waterside is currently going through analysis at the minute. Analysis, and it's gone through assessment, hasn't it? It's in analysis, yeah. So we will hopefully start seeing some answers from this soon. Cathedral is about to go into assessment. St Peter's, well, that was sort of 20 years ago, so we're not going to get... Yes, it was Alice. It was Alice dug that pit in the St. Peter. We're not going to get any more answers than we've already got for that one. But one thing is clear: if it isn't, even if it isn't a mass, all of these aren't contemporary. That these are separate events. At this period in Leicester, we think Leicester's population was between 2,000 and 3,000 people. So that one mass pit at St Martin's represents 5% of the town's population. So on its own, that is a major event. That is probably a third of the parish of St Martin's in that pit. And if these are a contemporary event, that is a major impact on Leicester. But even if they aren't individually, these are big events. Now, we don't know what they are. There's no records in Leicester itself that might point us to them that I'm aware of. And if this isn't necessarily what's causing it, but this account in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles does strike me. It's broadly the same period, and it is one of a line of events in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles that are talking about national events or events on a national scale. But it does say, such a sickness came on men, this is 1087, that full nigh every other man was in the worst disorder, that is, in the diarrhea. And that's so dreadful that many men died in the disorder. Afterwards came through the badness of the weather so great a famine all over England that many hundreds of men died a miserable death. So it's talking about national events causing mass deaths of people through sickness and through famine. So the 11th century was definitely not a nice place. It's one of a repeated set of events, certainly in the latter half of the 11th century. But it is interesting. I'm finding it interesting that perhaps we are seeing or could see a correlation between the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and physical archaeology on site, in that we are seeing proof of this sickness that is perhaps a national story. So there is lots more to come. First of all, though, watch out for us on BBC Two on Wednesday, the 3rd of January for Digging for Britain. We will, the Roman stuff from the Cathedral will be featuring on the 2nd episode, if I remember rightly. They will all be available on the iPlayer from the 2nd of January, I think, so, but as broadcasts on the 3rd. And if you want to keep track of the project, we are regularly blogging about all aspects of the project. They're quite random. They're generally whatever comes into my head at the time I need to write a new blog. But you can follow us on ULAS News, and you can keep track of the whole project through Leicester Cathedral's own website as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for both of the speakers of today. Now it's the time for Q&A. So I'm going to pass over the other microphone, but if anyone has questions, please raise their hands or put the questions in the chat online. So questions?
It comes to implementing projects sometimes you're working with and citing and using the historic search framework does have a significant impact in convincing developers to actually provide the resource to do the kind of programs of work you're talking about?
How can I don't think they always care. I don't think it's necessarily, and sometimes people can accuse you of doing personal research as well. So it can be actually quite a tricky thing to cite, because they'll say, well, you're doing research and you're not meant to be doing research. You're meant to be doing what's proportionate to the project and what I should be paying for, if that makes sense. So it's a double-edged sword. Sometimes yes, but I think it helps to provide structure, and it helps to provide good founded reason for doing that work. So on one hand, yes, but then sometimes that can actually be used against you as well. No, it's not, but actually this is where a strong local planning authority archaeologist is really important, because the research framework helps you identify significance and the significance of the site. And the point of the work is you have to fulfill your obligations to understanding that significance. And so actually sometimes you'll structure a piece of analysis work, and the local planning authority archaeologist will say, that's not enough, because actually this is super significant. So I can see here and here and here that you need to do more. And they will make that a necessary part of the condition for the client, and they will only sign off that condition if that work is done. So actually it's a tool for the whole system, really. It's not just for us, it's for it's to be able to identify some significance and being proportionate. So you can say, well, we need to do this because looking at the research framework, we desperately need to do it. It's a significant part of our work. If we don't do it, we're not fulfilling the work that we should be doing.
Interesting support framework makes a difference.
Definitely, and I think a lot of people use it and are more increasingly using it because it's such a powerful tool. So yeah. 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 It's still patchy, but I would say increasingly so people are using those frameworks, and outside of the East Midlands, other research frameworks are being further developed, and they're all there on that platform. So the East Midlands one is only one of however many are on there, and ours is the most developed, but the others are getting there. And again, I know from having worked beyond the East Midlands that again people are using them to help provide good evidence and supporting evidence to enabling further work to happen. So yeah.
Or just
I think they are. So I think Gavin and I were in a meeting the other month, weren't we? And they're looking to update the modern period now, but it costs a lot of money. So the person Stephen Willis, he did say he got some money, but it didn't cover his time. No. So they now need to start looking realistically at how much it costs to update these things, and they're starting to go through that process. So every single one will be updated, but it's going to take time because it's going to cost money, and well, everyone knows this thing. Yes, that's your summer holiday sorted. Yeah.
It's for you again, Alice. Sorry, Matthew. But, I'm just interested, what are the reasons for the lack of plant remains across Leicestershire? Is it to do with soil, or is it just they're not there?
I think they're not there a lot of the time. So soil conditions will come in as a factor to that. But so soil conditions probably as part of it. From what Angela has said previously, I think it's a real thing possibly. But the third thing which will affect it is people's sampling regimes on site. Are they taking 40 litres from context, because actually we found, looking at the Broadnook stuff, actually we've processed one part of something and we're getting near to the total number that will be statistically valid. And we actually have for a lot of those contexts, we have that material sitting in buckets, so we know, and this is part of framing the analysis phase, we will be doing the rest of that, and we've got good reason to do that. So that's our justification for doing that, because it will bring us up to that crucial, I think it's 50 or 100, I can't remember now. Rachel will know. But there's a key number, and if you've got that number, it's statistically valid. So it might actually be sampling, people's approaches to sampling on site, and yeah. It's really variable. I think it depends on who's running the site. It depends on the communication with the lab team. It depends on, it might have been that they've sampled tons and tons and tons, but when it came to it, there was absolutely no money, and so the processing never happened. It comes in and out of favour. At the moment, there's a big emphasis on sampling as being a really significant part of the process, and so everyone I know, I think most units are really pushing on this. So it's certainly increased, definitely, and it's just making sure that, you know, as a team, ULAS understands the significance of that, and that it happens. So, and explaining why, and actually it can change. It can be the difference between understanding something or not. And so, yeah. My mean stuff. Dig me more buckets. And we've even found that where we've had 2 buckets done, and actually we found one bucket's got nothing in it and the other bucket's got tons of stuff. So it's that scatter sampling. And so you need the 40. That's the golden number. You need 4 buckets, 40 litres, because that should give you a good representative kind of understanding of what's in that fill. So yeah.
We have time for one more question. There is one. Okay, so I would like to give another round of applause. And everyone is welcome